pleasure to introduce one of the world's and Israel's top researchers and scholars on the study of the Holocaust, or Shoa, Professor Hanna Yablonka. Born in Toronto, in Tel Aviv, which I learned today, Professor Yablonka is Professor Emerita from the Department of History at BGU and has recently retired from a most outstanding and distinguished career of well over 30 years. Her research has focused on the cultural and social impact of the Shoah on Israeli society, and she was the founder and first chair of the Israel Studies Department at BGU. She is the author of over 40 scientific articles, editor of 4 books, and author of 6 more. Professor Yablonka is a member of the Yad Vashem Council and was academic advisor of Yad Vashem's exhibition marking Israel's 50th and 60th anniversary. In addition to so many more responsibilities with titles, I can assure you there's a list as long as the paper. She is also chief historian of the Ghetto Fighters Museum. Professor Yablonka, the screen is all yours.
Thank you very much. I hope everybody hears me. Just give me 1 second and I'll put my presentation in front of you. But before I do so, we were really hesitant about this event of tonight. And we decided that in spite of everything, life should go on. And I'm sitting actually at the protective room now, and I'm speaking to you from the protective room. And I apologize in advance. Should the case happen that a siren will go up, I will have to interrupt my presentation. Well, this is a small price to pay, and I hope we'll have a nice hour together in the coming minutes. Let me just put up and share with you my presentation. I will not give you all of that is in it because it's longer than I needed to present to you, but I will do my best to make it a round and complete presentation of the story of the survivors of the Holocaust in Israel. Okay. What I'm going to speak to you with you tonight is one of the, not one, it's actually the most amazing story of immigration in the 20th century. And I've looked in a comparative aspect on all the immigrations of the 20th century, and the story of the immigration of the survivors of the Holocaust into the newly born state of Israel is really a remarkable, unique, and outstanding story of immigration. Of course, I will have to prove this very dramatic statement, and I will do so while we keep going on with my presentation. Now, besides being a very unique and outstanding story, there are kinds of images about the survivors that are prevalent now today in Israel, as the fact is that they are traumatized, they are scarred, they are poor, actually they can't make ends meet, they are helpless, they are weak, all of these, and they were silent, of course, the big mythological silence. All of these have not been proven in the exam of reality. And I will tell you how I take the story of the survivors into a new educational path in which I teach my students the Shoah as an empowering experience rather than an experience of weakness and helplessness. I think that this should be the prevalent narrative, the prevalent discourse of the Israeli society of today, and maybe also the prevalent discourse of the Jewish world today. Let me just start our voyage into the magnificent story of the survivors. I would like to start with the motto of my speech, and I will give only the floor to survivors of the Holocaust to speak. The motto is by Abba Kovner. Abba Kovner was the head of the underground in the Vilnius ghetto. And he said later on, he became an educational person, really very dedicated to keeping the memory, to promoting the memory of the Shoah. And he said the following sentence: the teaching of the Shoah, the teaching of the Shoah is first and foremost an action of an ongoing soul search within ourselves and through eternity. In such a soul search, the answers should never appear before the questions. Let me give you some kind of an interpretation of this motto. First of all, you have noticed, or you must notice, the fact that Abba Kovner is aiming his finger, he's pointing with his finger not towards the outside world. It's not an external command, it's actually an inner command, an introspecting command towards the Jewish world after Second World War. This is for him the most important thing. Let us look at ourselves in the perspective of the Shoah and stop being accusative towards the world. This is really not interesting. We who suffered from one of the biggest atrocities in human history, how should we deal with the Shoah? How should we interpret the Shoah, and what does the Shoah oblige us to be? Now, the question of soul search hasn't got an ending point. It's an ongoing process that shall never be coming to an end. The second part of the sentence, which is very important, in such a soul search, you should never use the exclamation mark. You should always use the question mark, and this question mark should stay on and be asked and asked again, which is in a way a critical point over those who try to teach you what are the lessons of the Shoah. The lessons of the Shoah actually should stay in the personal realm. Each individual should ask himself and compose for himself the message of the Shoah. Nobody, maybe only the survivors, could speak about the messages of the Shoah, and some of them I will introduce tonight. Now, I start with a personal aspect. This is my mother. My mother was born 1916. She's still alive. And as you can see, in 2 weeks, we shall celebrate her 105th birthday. This is a picture that was taken in the last Hanukkah. So that's actually how she looks today. She is a model of this trend of the Shoah as an empowering force. She came back after Auschwitz and she finished her medical studies, and she became the medical authority in the south of Israel, which is Beersheba, and also Ben-Gurion. She established the faculty of medicine at the university, and she established the health services for the Bedouins in the Negev. And I will end my lecture with one of her lessons of the Shoah, which I think you should take in your pocket once you go home after this evening. This is her number, and she is really a model person in my life, and not only in mine. Now, before we start, we have to define what do we mean when we say somebody who is a survivor of the Holocaust. Today, I know at least about 30 definitions of the term, but let me tell you what is my definition and upon which I have based my research. Let me also tell you that my research about the Holocaust survivors in Israel is the pioneer research on the topic, which is today a very in topic. And I have at least 7 PhD students who are already, some of them are already doctorates, giving aspects of this very wide and heroic chapter in the history of the state of Israel and the history of the post-Shoah. So who is the survivor? The survivor is the Jews of continental Europe who suffered under Nazi occupation or influence, both directly, being in camps, ghettos, forced labor, partisans, and hiding, or indirectly, those who had to escape, were expelled and deported by the Germans or their allies. Now, I would like to explain to you why I chose and phrased this definition, because of a couple of criteria. The first one is the fact that I went far away back into the late 1940s, and I looked who was considered to be a survivor of the Holocaust in the late 1940s, immediately after the end of Second World War. And this is one criteria, because at that time, being a survivor of the Holocaust was not a big honor. And on the other hand, which is also very important, it did not involve receiving all kinds of compensation and money from the Germans and other countries. The second thing is that who had this feeling that he has a kind of an historical mission to convey to the next generations, being over one of the most unique and unprecedented experiences in human history. Now, many of the survivors, by the way, asked after the war to immigrate from Europe overseas, some of them to America, but the largest group of survivors who immigrated were survivors who immigrated to Palestine, who later on in 1948 became Israel. To make you understand the huge victory and the huge power that is manifested by the survivors, I need to show you or to illustrate to you the starting point of what it looked like at ground zero. And I chose this paragraph, and I'll tell you what it is. It's a paragraph that was written by Yitzhak Zuckerman. Yitzhak Zuckerman was the deputy of Mordechai Nilevich, the commander of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. He later on was the establisher of the Lochamei HaGhettot, the ghetto fighters kibbutz in the Galilee. And he's telling you about the day of January 17, 1945, when the Russians came into Warsaw and liberated Warsaw. Now, by that time, Yitzhak Zuckerman immediately in 1939 escaped Warsaw in order to go to Russia and from there to Palestine. At a certain point, he decided that this is not the way a leader should act, and he went back to be with the children and the youth that he was guiding as a youth movement commander back to the Warsaw Ghetto. And he lived with all these youngsters and created a whole bunch of educational activities in the ghetto. By 1941, at the end of 1941, he heard from one of the emissaries who came from Vilnius. He's basically from Vilnius, by the way. You should know that Vilnius was between the two wars in Poland, was part of Poland. And he heard from this emissary that all his family was murdered in Ponar. And later on, he saw the end of the Warsaw Ghetto, the transportations, and he took part in, of course, in the uprising and also in the Polish uprising. And this is the history that brought him to this day in January of 1945. And I told you all of this so you can understand the strengths of the second part of this text, which I want to show you here. Each and every one of this part of the chapters of the things he's been through during the years 1939 and 1945 could devastate an ordinary, regular person. But he didn't. Look where is his breaking point. I remember vividly the day when the dog Tsivia was his wife, and I went to the square. We saw the Soviet tanks and the tankmen on the pinnacles, that their faces were solid black from the soot, and around them everyone was gleeful, women, children, and men, blowing kisses and flowers. And suddenly, for the first time, I felt like I couldn't stand. This is something you have to know. The moment of liberation, which varies in time from February 44 until May 8th and 9th, 1945, but the point of liberation is described by many, many survivors as the hardest days of their life. Each and every one of them felt as if he is the last Jew. Stemming, I'm sorry, there is a siren here, and I at least have to close the door of the protective room. So excuse me just a second.
We will stand by for Professor Yablonka. Please proceed.
Just a minute. Well, I guess you'll never forget this evening. This has never happened to you before, I guess. If you hear some booms, now the booms are starting to come. Wow. Are you with me? Okay.
We are indeed, and please do take your time. Thank you.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you. Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
We can hear you. Thank you.
Okay. When you have this description, which I just gave you, it's only natural to think that the reaction of the survivors to what happened in the Shoah and to their liberation, the day of liberation, would be and should be despair. Now, despair is one of the great menaces that every society can face vis-a-vis a very tragic historical event. So the natural reaction should have been despair, but this was not the story. And I'm going to tell you the story of what happened. Now, there were a few questions asked immediately after liberation. Actually, what now? What are we doing now? Should we go back to our homes? Should we go somewhere else? What should we do with our lives? Most of them were, of course, lost their parents. Some of them lost children. Some of them lost spouses. Where should we build our new lives? Should we take all our energies towards revenge? There was a big discussion taking place in all kinds of spheres of the survivors. None of these were answered unilaterally. But basically, what is very, very, very emphasized is the fact that from the very beginning, after they digested some of what happened to them, a small rise of hope came into the air. Now, a society without a hope will not keep on existing. Without a hope, there is no future for any society. And the fact that they chose life is such an impressive fact, which you will see in a minute as a firework, all the manifestations of. Doesn't move now. You see, something is, okay. Let me give you some demographical parts of the survivors. Who survived? Who were actually those who survived? First of all, the two most vulnerable age groups of the Shoah were children and those who were considered at that time to be old people. That means 55 and above. Almost no children existed from the age of 5 to 14. This was a childrenless society. We always speak about more than 1.5 million children that were murdered in the Shoah. The second group, which I only told you, there were no old people from the ages of 55 plus. So actually, most of the survivors were between the ages of 16 to 50, which is of course very, very interesting. And in a way indicative of the possibility to choose life with all its aspects. And it bears quite a bit of influence on what happened to them later on in Israel. One more thing that I want to tell you about the geography is the fact that 60% of the survivors were men. More men survived than women. I don't have the time to go into explaining to you why that happened. But this is a fact which will be in a minute very important. Total numbers of those who immigrated to Palestine and then to Israel. Between 1945, there were 70,000 who immigrated. Of this, about 72% were men because this was an illegal immigration. And then after the state was established, There were over 350,000 coming between in the mass immigration to Palestine after Israel was established. And then in the 1950s, another 50,000 came from Hungary and Poland, and mostly after the failure of the anti-communist uprisings there. And a total of more than 500,000 survivors immigrated to Palestine and Israel. Now, you must understand these numbers, and not in American or Canadian scope, but in Israeli scope. Actually, in the beginning of the 1950s, one of every 3 Israelis was a survivor of a Holocaust. While the Eichmann trial took place at the beginning of the 60s, one of every 4 Israelis was a survivor. It's a quantity, but it's also an essence, which is very important in a second, as you can see. Now you have the comparative numbers and you see what's the impact of the survivors in Israel. One of every 3 was a survivor. Now they had 3 identities. They were survivors of the Shoah, they were immigrants, and then they became Israelis. I will tell you, and I will show you to you, which is very important, the aspects of this identity and how they reflect this choice of life and the power of the story of the survivors. But before that, I want to tell you that after Second World War, the biggest generation in history was born. We call them the baby boomers. I have a guess that some of the people in the crowd, or maybe most of them, are belong to this very fortunate, by the way, generation of the baby boomers. And in the trend of the baby boomers, the largest birth rate was in the DP camps where the survivors of the Holocaust were living. This is very important because it shows you that the need to regenerate biologically, which is, of course, the biggest manifestation of the clinging to life. Now, 2 of these 3 identities are basically traumatic. To go through the Shoah is, of course, a trauma. Immigration is also a very big trauma. And bear in mind that immigrating from Europe to the Middle East bore a transition to one kind of place to a very, very different other place in the Middle East. Back it was the heat, another climate, another feature of scenery. This, of course, bears very deep impact. Now, this is in a way the periodization of the coming of the survivors, which I already told you. You can see there are chapters in their history in the state of Israel. First of all, the pre-state illegal immigration, then they're being a part of mass immigration, and of course, they're taking action and their participation in the War of Independence, which will take a big deal of our presentation. Now, in the 1950s, they are torn between Israelism and Shoah. This is very dramatic. And then the Eichmann trial and what followed. And I will try and make a brief comment on each and every one of them in a very short time that I was allocated. Now, I will not go into an analysis, which is very important, but I don't have the time, I'm sorry, to explain to you what was the Zionism of the survivors. I will say it in one sentence. Their Zionism was not an intellectual Zionism. It was a kind of impulsive Zionism coming from the bottom of their belly, because they actually knew it's an existential issue that because we didn't have a state of our own, we were murdered. We were actually, we had this tragedy. The lack of a state, of a Jewish state, was an existential element. So they immigrated to Palestine. Many of them chose to immigrate. And then there is the issue of the Israelism. In the 1950s, the survivors lived in 2 parallel identities that did not meet during all the years of the 1950s. The one was their Israelism, in a way, they were never absorbed into Israeli society. Nobody took them and absorbed them. They penetrated with vigor into the Israeli society and shaped it from within. They were actually the shapers of what we call today Israelism or Israeliyut, the culture. And I will show you in a minute a couple of examples for that. And there is the second parallel path, which is perpetuating the memory of the Shoah. Actually, the survivors are responsible for the enactment in the Knesset of the law of the commemoration of Yom HaShoah, and of course, the Nazi and Nazi accomplices punishment law, which they were the initiators of. They wrote many, many books during the 1950s. They gave testimony. The first course in university of the Shoah was the initiative of Mark Dvorzhevsky, a survivor of the Holocaust. This is, of course, a huge commemorating action, which is contrary to the notion of the big silence of the survivors. They spoke and wrote and commemorated and wrote useful books, and you must bear that in mind. Now, the chapters of the Israelism is comprised of on many parts, and one of the most important among them is, of course, the taking path in the military. I will give you the numbers in a second. I don't want to make a spoiler just now. And then culture. Culture, of course, is usually attributed to second generation immigrants, etc. No, this is not the case with the survivors. They were not Sabras, but they were actually very much so as Israelis. And then I will show you some of the Shoah to the War of Independence, some of the manifestations of their shaping the Israelism. Let me give you the number. 2/3 of the Jewish fighting force in the War of Independence, which is actually the constitutional event of the state of Israel, were survivors of the Shoah. This is a very dramatic statement. I have it in numbers, but enough is here what I said. Until only 20 years, in the last 20 years, this is a fact that is known today. But before the last 20 years, actually everybody believed in Israel that the War of Independence was fought by the Sabras who were born in Palestine and are the main fighting force in this Israeli constitutional war. This is not true. Actually, the survivors were the biggest part of those who created the War of Independence through winning the War of Independence and creating the existence of the state, enabling the existence of the state. You can see here one of the Palmach battalions. They have 13 soldiers. 8 of them were survivors of the Holocaust. And this is, of course, the case all over the place. The fact that we numbered, that I found this fact, that 2/3 of the fighters were survivors of the Holocaust, is really amazing. Now, it bears also in a way, a tragic aspect, because many of them were the only survivors of the family, and many of them fell in the War of Independence, which is, of course, the last remnant of families died in Israel, this very much hoped for land and country. But on the other hand, the fact that they fought in the formative war of Israel gave them from the very beginning a feeling that they are the owners of the country and they will shape the country as they understand and as they want. Now, let me move. This is, by the way, one tomb of somebody who came in 1945, the only one of his family, and they didn't even know to write on his grave the name of his father and his mother. He was so lonely and died so anonymously. This is a repeating case, just to show you the tragic part of what I say. Now, I will skip this, and I will show you now, before, of course, the War of Independence is the first manifestation, and the second is the culture and the fact that the survivors of the Holocaust were the shapers of what we call Israeli culture. Let me introduce you some of them. This is Naftali Bezem. You could see 1954, he painted. Now, when I say that the survivors were not silent, I don't mean only verbally. You cannot be silent and you can speak through art. You can speak through painting. This is, of course, very important. And this is a picture that was painted by survivor of the Holocaust, Naftali Bezem. You can see here somebody who is working with his hands, and his hand bears the number tattooed on his arm in Auschwitz. This is Dosh. Dosh actually gave the shape of what is the prototype of Israel, Srulik. This is amazing that a new immigrant shapes for the Israelis, for generations of Israelis, the image of who is an Israeli. You see the hat, you see the sandals, you see his lock from his hair. This is unprecedented by any category. This is Ephraim Kishon. Ephraim Kishon came from Hungary. He didn't know one word in Hebrew, and yet he is the founder of the new modern Hebrew that we speak today, which is also really unprecedented. He studied Hebrew. He used to write in his copybook the words of Hebrew in Hungarian letters. And so he studied Hebrew and then became an innovator of the language. Dan Reisinger, the father of the Israeli graphics. You see El Al, for instance. He shaped Habima, El Al. He shaped the symbols of some of Israel's leading institutions. And of course, on the other hand, the memory of the Shoah. Let me just give you one word about that. The tales of the survivors shaped for the Israelis gave the Israelis the first information about the Shoah. Now, there are three stages of knowing, which we name by information, knowledge, and awareness. The first, let me explain to you these three stages of epistemology. Information does not necessarily mean knowledge. The first stage of Israelis knowing about the Shoah came from the stories of the survivors. These were very local stories because the survivors did not know the story of the Shoah. Each and every one of them knew only his own stories. And they were always told in the first plural language, as if the survivor speaks for all those who did not get to live this moment. So it was local and in the figure of plural speech. When is this place when information became knowledge? If you don't understand it, I'll give you an example. In October 6, 1973, the Israeli very famous intelligence knew that all the Egyptian army is in the Suez Canal, but they didn't have a knowledge that this means war. So there is a gap between information and knowledge. The place where information became knowledge for the survivors is, of course, at the Eichmann trial. Let me tell you also one more thing. This is the Ghetto Fighters Museum. This is the first Holocaust museum in the world. It was created in 1949, and it is a grassroots museum. It was stemming from the burn in the hearts of those who created the kibbutz, and they actually are responsible for the first museum, which is not an institutional museum, but it stems from the feeling of the survivor that the Shoah must be remembered and, of course, shown and learned from. So now you know that the first Holocaust museum is not Yad Vashem, but Lochamei HaGetaot. So you can see here another venues of commemoration by the survivors. Now, these two parallel lines of Israelism and the Shoah and the turning point from information to knowledge happen in the Eichmann trial. I will have to skip a lot because I will have to finish very soon. At the Eichmann trial, actually, the character of the testimony of the survivors changed. Suddenly, 110 testimonies, witnesses came to the stage and told their stories in the first I language. And suddenly, two very important things happened. First of all, a knowledge of the comprehensive story of the Shoah became to form up for the Israelis. And second, the survivors stopped being only immigrants who should be absorbed into the Israeli society, but rather the Israelis grasped for the first time that the Shoah is not only the 6 million, but the Shoah is also the survivors of the Holocaust who immigrated to Israel since 1945. And from that moment, the survivors are attributed a whole new role in the Israeli society. They actually became the indispensable bridge between the exterminated European Jewry and the Israeli people who have not been through the Shoah. And from this moment on, they became one of the most consensual group in Israeli society, which is not a simple thing to be. I cannot stop here. Let me just tell you one of the implications of this changing status of the survivors. Actually, when in the first 15 years of the state was the main issue in the national identity of the Israelis. After the Eichmann trial, in an historical process, the Shoah became the main issue of the national Israeli identity. This is a very interesting process. It has many implications, some of them interesting, some of them very misfortunate. But let me show you just one implication of the thing. This is what the Israeli pilots and the commander of the Israeli Air Force released when they flew over Auschwitz in 2002. With the pilots of the Israeli Air Force over the skies of Auschwitz, he is, of course, the son of survivors of the Holocaust, born out of the ashes of millions of victims. This is a figure of speech. Of course, they were not born. Nobody was born out of the ashes of the millions of victims. Carries us their muted cry, salute their bravery, and vow to be the protector of the Jewish people and their land, Israel. I forgot here part of the sentence. I would just relate to the end of this manifestation. Of course, the pilots of Israel are not the protector of the Jewish people. Those who live in America should be protected by the American pilots. They are the protector of the Israeli citizens, and they include already, in addition, 20% of people who are not Jewish. The second, Israel is not a land. Israel is a state. This was the basic idea of Zionism, that we are people like any other people. So a whole new kind of Zionism, a whole new kind of national identity was performed actually by the stories and the message of many of the survivors after the Eichmann trial and the years that followed. At the same year of 2002, the last gathering of survivors of the Holocaust from all the world took place in Yad Vashem, and I will end here my talk by showing to you our living legacy. This is what they want us to take from the Holocaust, and this is very important for us to know. It's a 3-page manifestation, and I will go only very humanistic, very universalistic, very humankind love. There was no revenge from the survivors. They took all their energies to rebuild their life and be moral people. So let me just show you the end. From Har HaZikaron in Jerusalem, the words of Rabbi Hillel need to ring out loud and clear. What is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow human being. This is what is our heritage to the young generation. This is what we want to live with you. And this is what I hope you will take in your pocket once you go home tonight.
Professor Yablonka, thank you so much for your presentation. It was insightful and truthfully gave a perspective that often people don't necessarily think about when they think about the Shoah and the survivors of the Shoah. And that is that, you know, they made some incredible lives for themselves. They've supported the state of Israel in so many different ways, even the start of the state of Israel. We've got some questions that are lined up, and I'd like to just remind our participants that you can drop your questions into the Q&A box. It's just at the bottom of the screen. We've got one there, and we'll get to it in just a moment. But where I'd like to begin is really the start of your presentation, where you talked about, you know, the narrative of survivors and this is the myth that you alluded to, as weak and vulnerable. And it seems to be a narrative that persists in both Israel and in the diaspora. Why do you suppose that is?
Well, let me just give you the context. Today, we are actually at the end of the era of the survivors. They are disappearing from our lives, which makes me very, very sad. But this is the way of life. There is today a kind of a world discourse. It's not only in the Jewish world that you shape your identity by victimology. Who victimized me? And they fit, the story of the survivors fit very well into this state of mind, which is so globally prevalent today. But this is not the case. Now, media also contributes to that, because we have in Israel 3 days of commemoration of the Shoah. The first one is the international on January 27. The second is the Yud B'Tevat, when the religious people mark those who don't have a grave. And of course, the state-oriented Yom HaShoah, which is the national Yom HaShoah. And each of these 3 days, what does the media do? They go to one random survivor of the Holocaust. By the way, they never define who they speak about. So they go to one random whom they decide is a survivor of the Holocaust. They open his fridge. They show that he hasn't got anything to eat. He is poor. He doesn't have food. He needs the help of the country. And so they feel very nice because they help the survivors. Immediately the day after, nobody remembers this. And this shaped, in a way, a picture of the survivors as those who did not make it. But the fact is, and I know today about the story of the survivors in America, and I know the story of the survivors in France, and I know the story of the survivors in Italy. It's completely, but so dramatically different. The survivors are such succeeding people. Actually, in America, they made it big time. In Israel, they made it big time. So it's the discrepancy, the gap is so wide that I always have to start with refuting the common notion, which is completely not true, and then defining, and then giving the story of the success.
Yeah, yeah. And there's a certain amount of storytelling in that as well, right? Truth storytelling as opposed to the myth that's built around it. There's another question that we received, and you just spoke about survivors. What will happen when there are no more survivors left?
This is a big question. You know, I deal with the past. I don't deal with the future. I guess it depends. Well, first of all, around the world today, again, unprecedentedly, there are 500 museums of the Shoah, which is, I don't know of any other event in history gaining such a representation, educational representation. I don't know of any other event in history that gained an International Memorial Day, as did the Shoah, because this is an epoch-changing event, no doubt about that. What we'll do with it depends, first and foremost, I think, by the attitude of the Israelis and the Jews. What are we taking away from the Shoah? Now, every course that I give at the university, and I keep on teaching, although I retired, I keep on teaching.
You have knowledge to dispense, obviously.
and my last lesson on the course of the Shoah, I tell the students, listen, I have one thing to tell you. I want you to remember that the Shoah is an obligation. It's not a privilege. We have no privilege whatsoever. It's an obligation. So once a week, before you go to sleep, ask yourself, how did I stand the exam of the Shoah this week? As a son of those who continue the path of the survivors. If we do that, I assure you that the memory of the Shoah will be a big light to generations to come.
Right. That's a really, it's interesting as I listen to you. I was born in Israel, but I'm taking away so many new ideas on perspectives and how to process what has happened. So thank you for that. I'm going to take a question from the audience now. Elaine Lebenz, I'm sorry if I mispronounce your last name, asks how many courses, and it's funny because Professor Yablonka, you just alluded to courses at the university. How many courses or programs on the history or repercussions of the Shoah are currently available or planned for at BGU? And do you have any museum or exhibit library dealings with the Shoah at the university?
Wow. Actually, the only course about the Shoah is mine.
At the university.
At the university. And we don't have any museum or whatever. We have the Rab Center, which makes some kinds of conferences. But we have a big problem. Basically, Israel has a big problem with Shoah research because most of our young generation don't know languages. And in order to make research on the Shoah, you should know at least one European language. And in addition, of course, to know German. And our students know only Hebrew. When I studied, we had to learn another language, and I was born with another language. I speak Hungarian, for instance.
Right.
So the generation of scholars like me who know from home another language, and also the university asked them, compulsory, you could not get your degree without learning German, has passed away. No, we don't have that anymore.
Right.
And we lack many teachers to teach the Shoah.
Right.
Israel is now lacking, standing behind other countries in the research of the Shoah, which is a very, maybe it's for you, a surprising fact.
And you know what, you just spoke, it's interesting, you spoke about your personal experience, and you also spoke about your mom at the beginning of your presentation, and Mazal Tov, 105 years, that's wonderful. Yeah. And I'm really happy to hear that. Tell us a little bit about your personal experience of growing up with a parent who experienced the Shoah.
Well, my parents, both of them, came after the Shoah. Both of them finished their studies as doctors after the Shoah. They had this strength of going back to study, which is really amazing after losing all of their families. And they were really bon vivant people. They really loved life. They insisted that every year they go to vacation. They used to go to parties. They would dance. They laughed. I really grew up in a house, in a family full of light and full of love of life. And actually I was preached to love life. And it goes with the territory, because after I finished my master's degree, how did I come to research the survivors? I used to go every Wednesday with my father to have coffee, where I could say everything that I have and also criticize my parents. And after I finished my master's degree, we went on one of these Wednesdays meetings. And then my father told me, and this was by the way, the end of the 1980s of the previous century. And he said, I think you should write your PhD about the story of the survivors who immigrated to Israel. And I was sure there were hundreds of doctorates about this. And I went to my tutor, Yuda Bauer, and he said, well, finally, there is somebody who redempts this topic. And this is this is very clear, because my parents really wanted that the story of the day after and their big victory should be told in an historical perspective. And I'm grateful for him until today that I opened this field of research. This is a very optimistic, very heroic, very dramatic saga. And I can see, you know, that the first pilots of Israel, the first course of pilots in the IDF, 75% of its participants were survivors of the Holocaust. So wherever you touch it, surprising aspects came into light. And I think to the much satisfaction of my father, if he looks from up there and sees down.
And we have to say we are grateful that you chose this area of study as well, because we are learning a lot. We have a comment as opposed to a question from Francesca David. She says, thank you, Professor Yablonka. Just on a personal note, I went to school with Yossi Om, and I have one of your books. I am proud of your achievements. It is a privilege to get to listen to you. And you said you would come back to your mother at the end of the presentation.
Yes.
Was there something you wanted to share in regards to that?
Sure.
Yeah.
I take very seriously the moral decree that they leave us. Now, my mother, as I told you before, was the establisher of the health services of the Negev for the Bedouins. There's nomad Muslims who live in the Negev. And I went with her. We were invited once together to an interview on the television. And the interviewer asked her, Dr. Turek, please tell me, how come it was you, of all people, who established the health services for the Bedouins in the Negev? And my father said, it's not in spite of the Shoah. It's because of the Shoah. And I love this sentence, and I take it with me everywhere. And this is sometimes when I feel like I tell this story to the crowd, and I think it's a very good sentence to remember.
And a question for us from Miriam Tartar. She says, Dr. Jan Grabowski, University of Ottawa, researches Polish anti-Semitism and collaboration. Now, this research is actually banned in Poland. She's asking that you comment on that. What are your thoughts about research pertaining to anti-Semitism and collaboration in anti-Semitism being banned in certain parts of Europe?
Well, I will put it in a very, very general context.
Okay.
Because I know about the story of Grabowski, of course. It caused a huge controversy. But what is more important about this issue is that many countries in the post-communist era in Eastern Europe, Poland and Hungary, they turned out to be very nationalistic. And they create now a new narrative of their history during Second World War. And what hampers this narrative is the question of how did they treat their Jews during Second World War. Now, I'm very careful in judging, because the Polish people suffered from Nazi occupation very badly, very badly. So I don't judge, and I am not preaching, but it hampers and it kills the very story of when they deal with their history during Second World War, blaming them with anti-Semitism, blaming them with killing on their own initiative Jews, blaming them in giving up Jews to the Germans, is a kind of a story which they don't want to adopt. They would rather make it forsaken. And of course, like we are adults, we know that stories of life are never told in black and white. They are told in 50 shades of gray, as they say. And what I wanted to say about that is that at the Department of Righteous Among Nations at Yad Vashem, there are almost 8,000 Polish people who gained that title, which means that they actually endangered their lives to save Jews. So you cannot speak about the Polish as such or such during Second World War. There are many shades to the Polish people. And of course, you should also research those chapters that are inconvenient. Now, sometimes you look at yourself, and this is always what I do. Do the Israeli feel very comfortable with the Nakba? No, not really. With what happened here in 1948, we should also encounter this chapter. An adult, mature, self-confident societies should also confront the uneasy parts in their history, which is basically the biggest demonstration of power.
Professor Yablonka, as you can see, Mark Mendelson is rejoining us. I would like to wrap up just with one more question, if I may, because I think it's extremely relevant, especially with considering what is going on in Israel as we speak right now. And we saw it during your presentation as well. And the question comes from one of our colleagues in Vancouver, David Burson, who is the executive director out there. And he asks, Israeli society has been traumatized so many times. Tonight is another example of that kind of trauma. Do you feel that this is the fate of the Jews, to always be in survivor mode?
I don't feel myself in a survivor mode. So, and most of my friends don't. Israel faces, I have to be very honest, I'm always politically correct. No, Israel faces a very deep crisis today, which is not only a security crisis, it's also a very deep political crisis. It's also a very deep social crisis. And all of these are tangled in the last few days very, very dramatically. But yesterday, of all days, I suddenly had a notion of this old, very, very, not so old, but of the Second World War history. Because at Lydia, in Lod, the city of Lod, they were marking Jewish stores and Jewish cars and Jewish departments, and they actually set on fire Jewish stores and Jewish restaurants and Jewish cars. And this was one of the first time that in the Jewish state, where the Jewish people should feel very confident in their existence, without anybody to protect them, their property and their families, they were secured by police from their own homes because they were marked and they were really put in danger. Not speaking about the big damage that was caused to them materially. And suddenly it, in a way, echoed to me.
Yeah.
Germany in 1933, when they marked the Jewish stores in Berlin and in all other cities of Germany, and they banned the Jewish stores. Maybe I'm far-fetching, but it happened to me yesterday. So when you asked, I said, I'll be very sincere and I'll tell you the truth, that in a way it resonant in this.
For you. As for me, it's actually my hometown. It's where I was born. Thank you so much, Professor Yablonka. This was extremely insightful, and I'll hand it over to Mark now.
Thank you very much, and I hope the good days are coming.
Amen. Thanks, Galit, Professor Yablonka. What can I say? First of all, I studied at Hebrew University in 1969 in my third year, and Yehuda Bauer was one of my professors because I had to take a course on the Holocaust. So we at least have that as a connection. And I have to tell you that as the son of an Auschwitz survivor, whose tattoo number is A19234, a man who arrived in Israel in 48, fought in the War of Independence, fought in 56 and fought in 67, is really was the epitome of the survivor who fought tooth and nail to continue to live, and he did so until he was 95. The show has always been a subject very close to my heart, and it was just inspiring to listen to you. And when you spoke about what happened, the riots which occurred last night in Lod and Akko, and the marking of the Jewish businesses and homes. For the first time, and I always, whenever in the Arab-Israeli-Palestinian conflict, people throw around the Nazism, or with Trump, they would use it left and right. It came home to me too. And all of a sudden, the situation last night in our own Jewish state was a very dire one. Anyways, a masterful job in fielding questions as always, Galit. As I keep saying, CTV's loss is our gain. Huge thank yous to our listening audience for supporting us in the outstanding Ben-Gurion University. Perhaps you too would love to donate a building. We are always welcome to that, by the way. And I just said donate. I would like to just add a quick thank you to a bequest we received from Vancouver, which will provide 2 courses in Holocaust studies at BGU for the next 5 years. Huge thank yous to our listening audience. But seriously, all universities like Ben-Gurion, Harvard, McGill relies on its friends to support the research and building being conducted there. So if you are interested, please call one of our executive directors or me. That's my master territory. I would really like to thank my staff across Canada, as well as my national lay leadership, both of which I know to be the best of any other Israel-based organization from sea to shining sea. Check out the registration for our virtual national event, or national virtual event, featuring Shira Haas on our website, www.bengurion.ca, where you will also see the latest research successes of the brilliant staff at Ben-Gurion. Once again, I'm very proud to announce that our very own Simon Ben-Simon, Executive Director of Montreal and Ottawa, and in conjunction with our French-speaking colleagues in Belgium, Switzerland, and France, has spearheaded a webinar called Return to Casablanca, Retour à Casablanca, on June the 3rd, featuring Professor André Levy. Just as an FYI, when you receive the email notice, look at the picture, and it is an actual wedding picture of Simon Ben-Simon's Moroccan family in Casablanca in 1953. By the way, many of you will have received an invitation to join us at 2:30 and hear a special Chat Matzav, an explanation of what's going on in Israel and with the university. So look in your emails. You should have received that probably about a half an hour ago. So until we meet again on the screen, I wish you a COVID-safe period. Wear masks and keep social distancing. Join us for Shira Haas, and of course, our friends and family in Israel. We wish them a safe coming few days. Professor Yablonka, keep well and keep safe. And thank you so much to everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.